Well, what about the Western Hemisphere, our little region over here? Actually, there was a problem. There was a conflict in the Western Hemisphere between two different conceptions of how the hemisphere ought to be organized and developed. One of them was the conception that was dominant throughout Latin America. The other was the conception in the United States, and they were directly opposed. I'll quote the way the US State Department saw it, quoting, Latin Americans advocate the philosophy of the new nationalism that embraces policies designed to bring about a broader distribution of wealth and to raise the standard of living of the masses. This economic nationalism is the common denominator of the new aspirations for industrialization. Latin Americans are convinced that the first beneficiaries of the development of a country's resources should be the people of that country. That's important enough so that I'll reread it. This is the US State Department describing Latin America. Latin Americans advocate the philosophy of the new nationalism, which embraces policies designed to bring about a broader distribution of wealth and to raise the standard of living of the masses. This economic nationalism is the common denominator of the new aspirations for industrialization. Latin Americans are convinced that the first beneficiaries of the development of a country's resources should be the people of that country. That was quite counter to US plans. To deal with the problem, the United States called a hemispheric conference in Mexico in February 1945, near the end of the war. There, the United States presented what was called an economic charter for the Americas. It called for an end to economic nationalism in all its forms. The beneficiaries of a country's resources have to be US investors or their local associates, not the people of the country. And given power relations, the US position prevailed. All contemporary states have some variety of state capitalist economies, but there are variations. After World War II, into the late 70s, there was a period that's called regimented capitalism. The state capitalist system was controlled. There were social welfare measures. There was social democracy. There was tight regulation of finance. No huge financial institutions. Banks were banks. It's a place where if you had a little excess money, put it in. You wanted to borrow money to buy a car, you borrowed some money. That's what the financial system was. There were no major financial crises. It was a huge growth period, the highest growth period in capitalist history. High growth and egalitarian growth. The lowest fifth of the population did as well, actually a little better than the highest fifth. There were very high taxes, 90% on the very rich and on corporations. You can get a sense of what it was like from the words of Dwight Eisenhower, President of the United States in the 1950s, actually the last conservative president in the United States. The following ones are mostly radical rightists. Here's what Eisenhower had to say about labor. He said, "I have no use for those, regardless of their political party, who hold some foolish dream of spinning the clock back to days when organized labor was a huddled, almost helpless mass. Only a handful of unreconstructed reactionaries harbor the ugly thought of breaking unions. Only a fool would try to deprive working men and women of the right to join the union of their choice. Actually, it's the fools and the unreconstructed reactionaries who run the country and much of the world. Neoliberalism revered founder Ludwig von Mises in interwar Vienna, 1920s. He could hardly contain his joy when the proto-fascist Austrian government violently smashed the labor unions and the social democratic system. They were, he said, an impediment to sound economics, which means capital unconstrained. Labor unions interfere with the holy market by defending rights of workers, by calling for health and labor standards, other such crimes, and the proto-fascist government destroyed them. Right at that time, 1927, Mises wrote his classic work, Foundations of Neoliberalism, a book called Liberalism. Here's what he said, 1927. It cannot be denied that fascism and similar movements on the right, aiming at the establishment of dictatorships, are full of the best intentions, and their intervention has, for the moment, saved European civilization. The merit that fascism has thereby won for itself will live on eternally in history. That's the founding document of the revered guru of the neoliberal movement. Well, actually, there is one form of internationalism that has been very solidly implanted. That's what's called globalization. Globalization itself is neither good nor bad, depends what form it takes. This form of globalization means global integration of capital. NAFTA, World Trade Organization, they're called free trade agreements. Take, say, NAFTA, it's called a free trade agreement. The only correct words in the title, North American Free Trade Agreement, the only correct word is North American. Yes, it is North American. It's not free trade. It's not, mostly not trade at all. Certainly not an agreement, at least if the people of their countries count, because they were almost all against it. So NAFTA, like the World Trade Organization, the Uruguay Round Rules, is basically investor rights agreements. They are very highly protectionist, radical violation of free trade. TRIPS, so-called intellectual property rights, patent protection, goes far beyond the historical norm. Patents are much longer, harder to break. What's more, they're not only product patents, but they're also process patents. Not only the thing that was produced, but also the method of producing it. There's nothing like this in past history. If there had been, the United States would never have developed. In fact, England would never have developed. They both radically violated these rules, every other country as well. This is what is known in economic history as kicking away the ladder.